tactics, because when you build a nonviolent protest and Black Bloc appears and turns that protest into one which violates those nonviolent principles, you make diversity of tactics impossible. My problem with Black Bloc is precisely that, that they have used the Occupy movement essentially to carry out activities that have diminished that movement. I have a hard time understanding what their goals are and how they think these tactics are going to achieve those goals. I covered revolutions, insurrections, most of the revolutions in Eastern Europe, 5 years in El Salvador, the 2 Palestinian uprisings. I was in Sarajevo during the war. I'm not a pacifist. I understand that there are moments in human history when armed forces seek to destroy you, as they did in Bosnia, to sit in a basement in Sarajevo when we were being hit with 2,000 shells a day, constant sniper fire, 4 to 5 dead a day, 2 dozen wounded a day, and begin a discussion about pacifism would have evoked gales of laughter. So there are moments when violence, and I find having been around violence as a war correspondent for 20 years, always tragic. Violence, there are groups that set out to annihilate you and make any other response impossible. And one can look at the genocide of Native Americans as a good example of that. All of the attempts on the part of Native American communities to build any kind of a relationship with the white European settlers failed, not in small part because the Europeans violated every single one of the 400 treaties that they established. So I think that the goal of the movement, and we see it in Chicago, is to bring the kinds of numbers into the street, to make it a mainstream movement, and I think that was the power of Occupy, that it was mainstream. I would also like to say that Occupy itself was a tactic. And I don't buy this argument that Occupy is dead. Occupy is not dead. Look at the streets of Chicago. It may not be called Occupy, but if you've been following that strike, the most important strike in recent memory, in probably a few decades, when those teachers go into the police stations, when they're out on the street to use the bathrooms, the police will applaud. And that terrifies the corporate state. Because in every revolution that I covered, when the pillars or the foot soldiers of control can no longer be counted upon to defend a corrupt, fragile, ruling elite, then that elite is in danger. And I think throughout human history we have seen, even in the Russian Revolution, that what tips the balance is the capacity to bring the mainstream out in the street, usually through nonviolence. The Russian Revolution was largely a nonviolent revolution. It was when the Petrograd riots took place. They sent the Cossacks in to quell the riots. They began to fraternize with the rioters, and the Tsar abdicated within a week.
Thank you to you both. Is my microphone working? Okay. I've turned it on. Okay, thank you both for those opening statements. I just want to, before we begin, remind everybody how the format will work. It's going to be a fairly tight moderated debate with the person who is asked the question will have 4 minutes to answer, the other person will have 4 minutes to answer, and then the first person will have another 2 minutes to respond. I'd also like to remind people, out of respect for the speakers and respect for their point of view, if you could please refrain from shouting out or making comments while people are talking. Okay, so the first question will be to Brian. Do illegal tactics have a place in social movements in the United States? Who do they alienate or exclude, and who do they empower?
Well, the town that I come from, a small southern town that likes to think of itself as liberal, had an occupation. As all the way through January, and we had an encampment. And when it finally came down, only then did we find out for sure that what we had been doing was illegal. We intercepted a memo from the town manager asking to begin enforcing the laws again. Not only had the encampment and the protests that we organized been illegal, but in fact assemblies of more than a dozen people had been illegal. So everything we'd done had been illegal. In effect, we had participated in a criminal conspiracy to violate the ordinances of our little town. Now, I think many of the participants who at the end felt entitled to participate in the actions that they had throughout those months, if they'd known that they were embarking on this criminal conspiracy, would have been intimidated, would have maybe decided not to. This is one of the results of conflating legitimacy with legality. At the end, at the end of the event, they were proud that it had happened. They were proud to have participated in it. Now, of course, instead of having an occupation, we could have mounted a legal campaign to try to change the laws. But such a campaign would have prioritized the agency of the middle-class people, the people who already knew how the system worked, the people that were best served already by the system. And it wouldn't have been a participatory movement. Our occupation in my small town was illegal and participatory for the same reasons. Now, to emphasize this, that we can't conflate legality with legitimacy. This is a reason why I don't think we should use the word criminal as a pejorative, especially when the criminalization of huge parts of our population is an essential part of the perpetuation of white supremacy. In the Cancer and Occupy article, Chris Hedges used the word criminal as a pejorative. When we do this, we legitimize a weapon that the state can use against all of us, including Hedges and myself, but especially against the most vulnerable and most disenfranchised populations. It's also legitimizing a weapon that can be used to intimidate even well-intentioned middle-class people out of starting the kinds of protests that we will have to participate in to shake things up. Now, I'm sure that Mr. Hedges appreciates and agrees with most of what I've said. But what I want to hammer home here is that legal and illegal is the wrong question. The question we have to ask about tactics is, do they give us power over our lives and the environments we live in? Do we not just appeal to the conscience of those who rule us, or to the general public as an abstraction seen through the corporate media, but do we actually get a sense of our own strength through the tactics as we use them? Now, Hedges has said earlier that the most important thing is to get numbers in the street, and I want to critique this because I participated in 2003, on February 15th, I'm sure with many of you, in filling the streets in protests against the invasion of Iraq. It was, I think, the largest worldwide protest in history at that point, between 6 million and 15 million participated, or 30 million at the high end. And that didn't do anything except maybe help create a context in which Obama could eventually get elected. But 6 million of us could certainly have made that war impossible if we had felt entitled to use our capabilities to do that. It might have been called violent if we had, but it certainly would have averted a much greater violence. The place that I'm getting at with this is that our occupations also, they last longer when we are not afraid of our own strength. They last longer and they're more effective. All of our actions are more effective when we are not just appealing, not just making a supplication, but using our power together to the best of our ability.
Thank you, Brian.
First of all, just when I use the word criminal, I'm talking about Wall Street. In terms of illegal tactics, just any act of civil disobedience is considered illegal, and if it isn't illegal, they'll make it illegal. This is why I sued Barack Obama and Leon Panetta over the National Defense Authorization Act. Section 1021, which permits the U.S. military to carry out domestic policing to seize American citizens who are deemed to be terrorists or people who are related with what they nebulously call associated forces, and to hold them without due process in military facilities until the end of hostilities. Judge Catherine Forrest in the Southern District Court of New York has issued a temporary injunction, which the Obama administration, by the way, has appealed, and we're waiting to see whether that's permanent. There's no question that that piece of legislation, which is passed in the name of anti-terrorism, is part of the long attempt dissent. And we saw with Alexa O'Brien in US Days of Rage, who was one of the plaintiffs, that when WikiLeaks dumped the Stafford emails, 5 million emails, there was a back and forth attempting to link US Day of Rage with Al-Qaeda. So the debate about illegal tactics is a faux debate. When I was arrested in front of Goldman Sachs, that was considered illegal. And I'm not a believer in appealing to the formal systems of power which have betrayed us, so that basically all tactics that we use from now on will be deemed by the security and surveillance state illegal. The question is which tactics are effective and which are not. I think the power of the Occupy movement was that it was a mainstream movement. It articulated the concerns and the sense of the injustices and the grievances of the mainstream, and I think if you read the polling, it supports that, whether it's over our healthcare system, whether it's over the chronic, long-term underemployment and unemployment, whether it is the paralysis within the state itself to respond to what's happening to us. And mainstream, and attracting that mainstream, I think, is what terrified the state, the corporate state itself, and it's why the Obama administration led a coordinated effort to attempt to physically eradicate these encampments. For me, that was a seminal moment, because at that point, the corporate state said, we will only speak to you in the language of force. If they could respond rationally, and Krugman in column after column appeals for a rational response to the economic crisis, they would have, at the minimum, made a moratorium on foreclosures and bank repossessions. They would have forgiven student debt. They would have passed a jobs program, especially targeted at people under the age of 25, and they would have given us a rational healthcare system. But they did not do that. And it's always the ruling class that determines the parameters of revolt and rebellion. I would argue that's what's happening in the streets of Chicago is an integral part, an organic part of the Occupy movement, although they don't use the name Occupy. Remember that they essentially turned their backs, the organizers in Chicago, on organized labor because they weren't on their side, and the Democratic Party, and they have essentially confronted the power structure itself.
Thank you.
Well, it seems like Chris Hedges and I believe many of the same things. That's why it's interesting for us to be on the stage together. I have to emphasize, since he didn't acknowledge this, that he was using the word criminal in the Cancer and Black Bloc, the Cancer and Occupy piece, to refer to many of us. He was saying the word for what many people in this room had participated in as protesters is criminal. It's really important to get at this and to understand what this does. The thing that he said in the beginning about the idea that diversity of tactics can only be imposed by a kind of uniformity is confusing to me also. It certainly can't be imposed by, you can't impose this uniformity by a strategy of division, right? You can't impose a uniformity by a strategy that takes many of us and says, your participation is illegitimate. You are criminal. You need to be forced out of this movement. So I want to emphasize, first of all, that I think that is a losing strategy. The other thing I want to say, did anybody, the thing about Occupy and what tactics alienate people. I want to return to what I was arguing earlier, that the Occupies that were more confrontational, that pushed the envelope farther, lasted longer. And Occupy Oakland, for example, if you believe the Adbusters statement that came out after May Day, maintained momentum significantly after, for example, Occupy Minnesota, or many other occupations, right? Why is this? And the Chris Hedges of the world will say that the problem is that we, us militant protesters, are alienating everybody else. And I want to call attention to everyone, call to everyone's attention that in February of 2012, after all of the protests, all of the black blocs that had been described as taking place in the Bay. The Oakland Tribune ran an article.
Right.
A poll. 10,000 people were polled. Do you support Occupy Oakland? 94% said yes. After everything.
Thank you. The next question. The next question is to Chris. One of the controversial aspects of the Black Bloc is that it enables people to act anonymously in a group. What are the benefits and drawbacks of participants in social movements being able to preserve their anonymity? What are the effects of a movement based around public figures and transparent organizing?
Well, acting anonymously in a group is a gift to the surveillance state because they can cover their faces and essentially hide their identities. I mean, this is a difficult question because as the sophistication of electronic profiling increases, to step out into the street, even for a nonviolent demonstration, means that you can be instantly identified. However, I think in the end I come down with Václav Havel in his 1978 essay, The Power of the Powerless. We can't beat the security state at their own game. It's only, as Havel writes, by living in truth, by exposing the charade fiction of American democracy, and refusing to pay homage to that fiction, by having complete and utter transparency, that we can survive as a movement. This is not a moral question, by the way. It's a tactical question about what will work. As I mentioned before, I have been in conflicts. The war in El Salvador would be one, Bosnia would be another, where unfortunately the violence employed by the dominant class did not allow resistance to take any other form than violence. But I think we still have enough space, and I think that it's important. Remember, we're fighting to not only build a movement, but build a consciousness. And that consciousness will come only when we bring people into the streets. One of the beauties of Occupy was precisely that educational aspect. After they shut down Zuccotti Park in November, the constant refrain I would hear is a kind of mourning for the library itself. And I think that was, again, one of the aspects of the Occupy movement that deeply disturbed the power elite, that ability. And you went to Zuccotti on weekends, and there would be mothers and fathers pushing strollers up and down the street. Now, that is far more terrifying to the elite than a small group of people with their faces covered going through the street, chanting or throwing rocks or tipping over trash cans. What are the effects of a movement built around public figures? You can't build a movement around public figures. I mean, that was also the beauty of Occupy in that it wasn't horizontal, it was vertical. And I think that's extremely important. I mean, in that sense, I would be interested in that you don't want to build those horizontal structures. And finally, the transparency of organizing. I just don't think we can beat them at their own game. Having covered these kinds of issues for the New York Times, it gave me a kind of window into the power, the frightening power of the security and surveillance state, and the tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars they have at their disposal. It's just, to follow that route, I think is probably to guarantee our own defeat.
We always, in the streets as well as in the newspapers, we hear this over and over. Why don't you show your face? Be a man, this kind of thing. And it reminds me of what the judges and prosecutors always say when my favorite political prisoners are facing the bench. They say, "You cowards. Why did you take such a cowardly route?" From the Boston Tea Party, and probably before until now, anonymity has been an important part of almost every powerful social movement. This is not a coincidence. The Zapatistas, whom I know Hedges has spoken highly of, took great pains to legitimize the wearing of the balaclava. Closer to us, in terms of our national context, in Quebec, the student strike earlier this year that Hedges has also spoken highly of, one of the main ways that the government cracked down upon that was by passing a mask law. Now, in the age of live stream, if you call in sick to work to go to Zuccotti Park, you had better be wearing a mask, right? This explains why many of us who are on probation or who have vulnerability in our immigration status, who are taking much greater risks than middle-class people who have secure jobs, opt to be anonymous. And I want to emphasize this. A movement that only legitimizes transparency marginalizes the vulnerable, right? Marginalizes those who are most at risk in the society. And I will not tell those who are more vulnerable than myself that their masks should be off, that their faces should be exposed, so that they will look good for the cameras, you know, so that my idea of strategy can be advanced. I consider that irresponsible. And the people for whom there is little risk to going with their faces uncovered, to participating in these movements, which, as Hedges has emphasized, are often illegal. You know, the people who face less risk can't win even what they want alone. A movement that only legitimizes transparency, it can't even win what the middle class wants. And I want to say, this is no lunatic fringe we're talking about again. This is many of the people in this room and many people around the country. And the question always comes up, how will we be accountable to each other? We have to be accountable to each other. We're in this movement. We know each other. The people in black blocs who are taking special risks have to be accountable to each other, and also have to take very seriously the question of how others will feel about what they do. They're taking greater risks than anyone else. It's more important to them. Finally, about the question of agents provocateurs. I have known agent provocateurs personally. I have seen how they operate. It's not an abstract question for me. I want to say the greatest risk and the greatest danger that they have posed to other people has not been when they were wearing masks. If anybody listened to Democracy Now! About the events in Austin recently, it's not when you're wearing a mask that you can do the most harm as an agent provocateur. The black bloc has come about in a time when there is this increased surveillance. And the main way that this surveillance state represses us is through isolation and neutralization. You know, isolating and neutralizing those who pose the most threat. Masking is a response to this. It's a strategic response. And I don't think that the arguments against it that are framed as strategic outweigh the benefits of a participatory movement. Finally, it may be, Mr. Hedges, that your face on the other side of the rifles of the police will persuade them not to shoot, but some of us, whether we mask or not, they don't hold back.
If this was an issue that was based solely around masking, I'm willing to concede many of these points, but given the intrusion of the security and surveillance state. The problem is that for me, with the black bloc, the masking comes with other tactics. And you talk about the vulnerable. If, you know, there were weekends that I was in here with my small children, if you are an elderly person, if you are disabled, and you are joining a group that you think is nonviolent, and there becomes black bloc action that provokes a response from the police or tear gas, you can't get away. In the same way that you know, somebody who's alone and young and able to sprint down a road can. But I think the issue you raise is a legitimate one. And when you look at the sophistication that is now being employed, you know, anybody who went to Zuccotti saw that platform up there, and they were filming night and day. So I think on the issue of masking, I'm willing to concede it. I just, for me, the problem is that the masking comes with other tactics that I think are counterproductive.
I want to emphasize that this is not an abstract question for Chris or for me. Chris is a war correspondent, as he's pointed out. Everywhere he looks, he sees ethnic cleansing, even if it's just a kid with a spray paint can. I'm here coming from my history of participating in social movements. That is what I draw on to speak about this. When I think of violence and nonviolence, I think about an afternoon in Quebec City in April of 2001 at the protest against the Free Trade Area of the Americas Summit. The police, making no distinction between so-called violent and nonviolent protesters, filled the entire city center with tear gas. They were shooting rubber bullets at us. And in that situation, I would not, myself and the 50-some-year-old mother of two that I was there with, we would not have been able to breathe if it had not been for the people in black taking those tear gas canisters and throwing them back. You know? They were the only people between us and hospitalization. And they were the only reason that we were able to stay there, since the police wanted to clear us out in the same way that the occupations last fall were cleared out. Now, the next day, when the newspapers came out, the front page news read, "Violence erupted when black-clad protesters began hurling tear gas canisters at the police." This shows to me how this discourse of violence works in our society. Violence is indistinguishable from code for legitimate use of force. Now, that's why when the slumlords force your rent up, that's not violence, but when you resist an eviction, that's violence. That's why dumping carcinogens into a river is not violence. But sabotaging the factory that does this is violence. That's why putting 2.3 million people in prison in this country is not regarded as violent. But trying to de-arrest someone, trying to rescue them from the hands of the police, is called violent. Defining as violent is a way to delegitimize people, to exclude them from the field of legitimate discourse, and to justify the use of force against them. It came up earlier tonight that in Egypt, Obama himself called this a nonviolent revolution when there was tremendous interchange of projectiles with the police, when they burned down, I'm told, 99 police stations, and the headquarters of the ruling party. I want to say that was nonviolent. That was deemed nonviolent because they won. Because it was necessary after the fact, after they had won, to say that what they had done was legitimate. If we start out saying, we will be nonviolent, we're nonviolent from the beginning, we cede that whole territory. We say, we will only do what is already recognized as legitimate in this society. And this equips people like UC Police Captain Margot Bennett in her quotation after a Berkeley conflict to say, those students were being violent. They refused to unlink their arms. Now, I always hear this critique when I advance these points. I always hear the critique, but they want us to get violent because it's a battle they can win. I want to clarify this because it's imprecise. It's not that they want us to get violent. The best thing would be if we remained inactive or only involved in harmless pacifist action, staying inside the free speech zones and refusing to defend ourselves. That would be ideal. But if we're going to do something specifically, they want us to pick battles that we can't win, right? They want us to escalate into, for example, clandestine armed struggle, as Derek Jensen, who I believe is Chris Hedges' friend, endorses. Now, and I want to say clandestine insurgency is absolutely the wrong direction. We can't win that kind of struggle. What they fear most is us collectively employing a diversity of tactics and becoming collectively unrulable, becoming collectively impossible to control. And that looks, participating in that looks very different to all of us. Thank you.
Well, having been in various conflicts around the globe, I can assure you that the security surveillance state could care less about people throwing rocks or breaking windows, especially when you're dressed in Kevlar and you're carrying automatic weapons. That becomes a mechanism which does not in any way seriously threaten in an existential way does is solidify those security forces or bond those security forces to a corrupt ruling elite. I covered the breakdown of East Germany. That was, at least until the United States, in the current era, the most sophisticated system of internal security in the world, the Stasi state. And you mentioned earlier the Iraq demonstrations. The problem was not the demonstrations. The problem is that we were unable to sustain them. And the anti-war movement voluntarily gave them up in 2004 because it foolishly thought electing John Kerry, who was no less militaristic than George Bush, was a good tactic. It turned out to be a very stupid tactic. The protests in Poland, in East Germany, were ones that went on for months and months. And they originally in Leipzig, and I was there, were pulling just a handful, a few dozen people, maybe 100, 200 people, and then in September of 1989, suddenly 70,000 people were out into the streets. You never know what ignites a population. That's one of the mysteries of uprisings. And Erich Honecker, the dictator of East Germany, sent down an elite paratroop division to fire on the crowd. And when they got there, they wouldn't do it. And Honecker lasted, after 19 years in power, another week. The same was true in Prague. It doesn't always work. There are times when mass movements, 1979 in El Salvador, which I also covered, when they brought huge numbers of labor union student people in the street, and the response of the Salvadoran security forces was to set up machine guns on the roofs of buildings and carry out a massacre, which triggered the insurrection. But we haven't yet seen that kind of violence. And I would remind you that in Egypt, they gunned down 800 people. And they also captured thousands of people and tortured them, disappeared them, tortured them to death. And anybody who has covered, as I have, the military complex, understands the killing potential, which I see our mass media now celebrating with this book, No Easy Day. These, let's be clear, are death squads. 60,000 special forces operations. And when empires crumble, and they crumble from within, which is what's happening, the forces of control on the outer reaches of empire migrate back to the center. And having spent 2 decades on the outer reaches of empire, I know their capacity for violence and murder. We've already seen it in the drug war. A night raid in Oakland is no different from a night raid in Fallujah. Same outfits, same automatic weapons, command helicopters with searchlights. It's exactly the same. All of those forces are being brought back. And if you are to confront them through means other than nonviolence, then you're going to have to confront them at a level of violence that threatens them existentially.
Okay, I want to finish making my...
Please keep this.
All right, I want to finish making my earlier point.
Please allow our speaker to speak. Thank you.
Damn.
We live in a time when people are getting increasingly desperate. And the question is not whether people are going to revolt. People are going to revolt. The question is what happens when they revolt. People are going to do things that are, that today we see as illegitimate or as crazy. People are going to act out. That's the word for it. Now, when this happens, if there is no movement that they can participate in to act out against their conditions, they're going to act out in isolation. They're going to act out, they're going to join clandestine armed insurgencies, or they're going to be, they're going to throw their lives away in a way that is antisocial and unproductive. The question is, how do we make a movement that can make the most of all of our despair and desperation, that can create a possibility when we are at our breaking point to push forward in a way that benefits all of us. Now, if we make the Black Bloc into a bugaboo, and we say that all those who act out are monsters and are against the movement and are going to ruin it, then we create a situation in which these people can only act out autonomously in a way that doesn't contribute to what everybody else is trying to do. And I want to argue again that this cancer in Black Bloc, cancer in Occupy, thank you, cancer in Occupy line is doomed to separate the movement into those who are not able or willing to push it far enough for there to be social change, and those who will be isolated, like the Weather Underground, unable to bring about the change that they need. Do I have one more second? And the last thing I want to say is about these tactics, like rock throwing in Egypt. It's entirely hypothetical whether Mubarak could have been toppled without all the struggle that people engaged in. As for the tactics that people engaged in the United States, somebody is going to bring up window smashing sooner or later, so I might as well be the one to do it. We have to understand these in context. In Oakland, perhaps the reason that people have engaged in property destruction now is that when Oscar Grant was murdered a few years ago there, the police officer who shot him execution style on the back of the head did not even receive charges until there were riots in downtown Oakland. These tactics are seen as being essential ways for people to defend themselves even in the existing situation, and not only to transform the world into the place that we want to be.
The next question is to Chris. Violence is sometimes associated with hypermasculinity and machismo. How would you respond to these claims? Is non-violence any less hypermasculine, and why or why not?
Well, violence, let's talk about violence in terms of war. Violence is a hypermasculine endeavor because it is about crushing capacity for empathy, compassion, nurturing. It's why in every conflict that I covered, there was a fusion of pornography and violence, such as the war in Bosnia. Is there's a kind of explosion, because violence is about turning another person into an object that you destroy. Objectification is classically hypermasculine, and military cultures are hypermasculine for a reason, because it is an attempt to shut off feeling. You raised the issue of, is Gandhi, for example, because he has patriarchal tendencies, patriarchy and hypermasculinity are not the same thing. As feminist writers like Mary Daly and Andrea Dworkin and others have pointed out, we live in a patriarchal society that comes with male domination. And in the case of this country, a fusion of essentially male domination and white supremacy. And it is when you embrace that domination that it's an incremental step to hypermasculinity. One of the sort of issues within wars that was always so disturbing was the way all of those sort of qualities, those abilities to reach out and connect with others were essentially shut down through the hypermasculine culture of violence and the way violence was eroticized. And I think that violence for me, and I've written this, that war is a drug. War is probably the most powerful narcotic invented by humankind. And once you imbibe in that drug, it does what all drugs do. It severs you from human contact. And I speak to somebody who, like most war correspondents, leapt from war to war to war because I couldn't exist outside that circle. about annihilation, and finally, in the end, it's about self-annihilation. And I think, you know, a lot of the great feminist writers have a lot to say about this. So yeah, hypermasculinity for me is something that is frightening. And when you act as a group, when you surrender moral autonomy to carry out in a crowd or a mob, which is of course what police are. You destroy their identities so that they become a mass. And it makes it extremely enticing and even thrilling to carry out acts that are destructive and I think ultimately self-destructive.
So, is the black bloc as a tactic hyper-masculine?
Yeah!
To say this, I think there's some problematic gendering going on here. As far as whether the anarchist spaces that I've been in that have produced black blocs have been male-dominated, often they have been. Not as male-dominated as many of the Occupy organizing spaces that I've been in, to speak honestly. To such an extent that that's been a notorious criticism by some of my female and queer friends of trying to organize in Occupy. But really, this is just an anecdotal question. You know, you can decide that that what the black bloc does is violence and therefore it's masculine. That's not my gender analysis. But what I want to emphasize here is that Hedges has not participated in a black bloc or in organizing for one. So really what's going on here is that the mask is a reflective surface onto which people outside of it can project their assumptions. That's all I want to say from my own perspective. I think that it's in poor taste for white men to use privilege politics in pissing matches with each other, to try to convince each other of hypermasculinity or this or that. Instead, I'd like to foreground somebody else's voice here, a woman who can't be here today because she is serving a year in prison in Toronto, accused of being the so-called leader of the Black Bloc at the protest against the G20 protest, the G20 summit in 2010. Her name is Kelly Rose Floatback, and she answered the same question with these words. Patriarchal society in general is infected with a deeply disturbing hypermasculinity. Patriarchy and prejudice against people with disabilities are deeply connected, and both pressure people to believe their worth depends on whether their body is attractive, useful, normal, and non-threatening according to dominant standards. Many of the things that people vandalized during the G20 were symbols of patriarchy, like window advertisements with emaciated, underage-looking girls in hypersexualized poses. Being constantly bombarded with these unhealthy images is hurtful and violating to people of all genders. Global capitalism is also inextricably linked to kinds of violence and exploitation that disproportionately affect women and girls. So in that sense, any form of opposition to the G20, multinational corporations, or trade blocs is also in opposition to patriarchy. There are many documented cases of female workers in sweatshops being systematically raped because they protested their work conditions. And the colonial history and ongoing economic exploitation of the Congo is what has caused the civil strife and pandemic of gang rapes that Congolese women are suffering right now. If Chris Hedges wants to speak out about the prevalence of hypermasculinized violence in the world, he should rail against governments and multinational corporations, not a scraggly bunch of protesters who oppose them. Now, I know that that is one of the things that Chris does, but we are here today because in practice, his rhetoric helps the state to marginalize, to invisibilize, and to imprison women like Kelly Rose Floatback.
Well, I can assure you the state doesn't give a damn about what I write. Somehow the idea that they're using my writings as a use to imprison people and marginalize them is absurd. I've been blocked out of mainstream as a black bloc. You know, I'm hardly a figure that the establishment uses to credentialize themselves. You know, on the issue of violence, on the issue of diversity of tactics, if the Black Bloc want to carry out an action, I actually think they have every right to do it. I'm not going to join them, but I'm also not going to inform them. My problem is that they make it impossible for those of us who want to build a nonviolent movement to carry out our action. And there has to be a place, there is a place in insurgencies and uprisings for various movements. When I covered the war in El Salvador, you had groups such as the Catholic Human Rights Group that would document the killings by the death squads and yet studiously espouse nonviolence. And yet when I traveled with the FMLN rebels, they would often give me carefully typewritten testimonies by people who lived in combat zones who had suffered at the hands of Salvadoran security forces, and they would ask me to deliver those typewritten testimonies to the Human Rights Office of the Catholic Church, because they knew that congressmen and others who came down would be able to hear those testimonies. And what I'm asking for is diversity of tactics. What I'm asking for is that you respect nonviolence, and you carry out actions that don't turn our nonviolent activities into your vision of what you think resistance should be.
We have one last question before moving on to the audience questions. This question is to Brian. How do these individual issues relate to our greater visions of social change, how it comes about, and what we're trying to do? How can our tactics distinguish and free us from the institutions we oppose? And how can our tactics embody the world we hope to create?
Thank you very much. I want to explain why I am making an effort to critique this cancer in Occupy, there I got it this time, line. I want to emphasize why that's an issue. Chris and I are not that far apart ideologically. The one place that we differ is how we respond to the appearance of more militant tactics. Now, I'm with Chris. There's a time and place for everything. I agree with him about that. But that's not what he claimed in the Cancer and Occupy piece. He said that the Black Bloc is a totally distinct social body that has its own agenda, that is against all of you, even those of you who have participated in Black Blocs, and that it has to be excised like a medical abnormality. Abnormality? There we go. This runs counter to my understanding of how social movements work. And it seems to me that we have a really different idea of how this works. My theory, my impression from what I've seen is that in a situation in which most people don't feel entitled to use certain tactics, whether it is to do things that are illegal, or to defend themselves, or to mask their faces when they need to do that to protect themselves, in this situation, what always happens is that a few outliers try out a new tactic. And at first it's extremely controversial. But if they do it long enough and seriously enough, and they always make the effort to explain themselves to others, eventually, if this tactic is of use, it can catch on, and it can be useful to other people. A good example of this is that, Occupy Wall Street was not the first occupation in this country, right? If you go back to 2009, there was an occupation in the New School that at the time was controversial, did not take off, was regarded perhaps by many as antisocial or confusing, and that sparked occupations on the West Coast. And through this long, slow process over years, the foundation was built upon which Occupy Wall Street could take place. Now, similarly, people in this country are now trying to legitimize the wave of tactics that can get us out of the Occupy impasse. If we call these people monsters, if we take every step that we can to delegitimize them, we will paralyze ourselves and the movement for the future. Rather, we should be explaining, we should be taking advantage of the ways that we're situated, and Hedges is situated better than I am for this purpose, to explain to others why people people engage in these actions, why they are deemed necessary, and to draw from what is useful, what all of us can apply, whether or not we ever wear a black sweatshirt. This is the business that we have to be humbly setting about, because as Chris said, violence isn't glorious, you know. But I also want to emphasize everything that is called violence is not bad. In fact, a lot of it is things that if we can do them, we will be able to break the deadlock of oppression that holds us where we are. And finally, I want to say, if you don't want those who participate in black blocs, if you don't want those who are part of this movement to be able to make this case, to be able to try out new tactics and be able to legitimize them, you will have to demonize us to succeed. You will have to do what you did in Cancer of Occupy. You will have to say things about us that just aren't true or representative. You will have to make us into monsters. And in fact, there's too many of us in this movement for this to happen without this dialogue. Whether you want it or not, it's going to happen. And I'm not even sure that you want to set about this demonization. But to conclude, I want to say, what you said a second ago, that what you say is useless to the police, I don't buy it, because I saw your line, word for word, quoted by police, not attributing it, of course, but using exactly the same framework. Black bloc is outside, black bloc is not legitimate protesters, black bloc is chaos, banned hooligans in newspaper coverage building up to the RNC, the NATO protests, and elsewhere. So I feel like the fact that you, as somebody who agrees with many of the people here about the situation, the fact that you handed this narrative to the police was actually extremely irresponsible and dangerous for lots of people.
Well, the reason I sued Obama over the NDAA is because I knew the first group they were going to go after was the Black Bloc. And then they'll work their way up the ladder. They pick off the marginal groups first. They've already done a pretty good job of decimating Muslim American activists, whether it's Fahad Hashmi or Sami al-Arian or anyone else. And they use precisely the same tactics. In the case of Fahad Hashmi, he was held here in New York in Guantanamo-like conditions, 23 hours a day in isolation, naked. They never turned off his his light bulb in his cell. What they were using to prosecute him with were tapes of talks that he'd given as a student activist when he was at Brooklyn College. You look closely at the Muslim American community and you can see where they're going and what they want to do. And the next group they'll go after, and you've already seen it in the case was in Cleveland, where they got these, used an agent provocateur to get these kids supposedly to blow up a bridge. And we saw it, as I mentioned earlier, in the NDA case where they tried to demonize U.S. state. They know what's coming. I agree with Brian that we are certainly headed for a period of deep instability and unrest, and the corporate state is working overtime to create the legal structure whereby any whisper of dissent becomes impossible. I'm not going to get into this graver argument as to whether what I write, suddenly gives the Homeland Security an idea of, what they want to say. Maybe they are. Maybe they read everything I write. I hope they read everything I write, but I kind of doubt it. The question really comes down to what's going to work. And I have yet to hear a coherent explanation on the part of Black Bloc. Number one is the kind of vision that they have for the society that we want to create and how these tactics are going to get us there. If we do not bring the mainstream over to our side, I don't think we can win. And I think what we have not raised is that this backlash could very well be hijacked by proto-fascist movements. The Christian right. And unlike us, they are going to be bankrolled by the most retrograde elements elements of American capitalism, the Koch brothers and others, just as the German industrialists bankrolled the Nazi Party. Political paralysis creates extremes, and the longer that paralysis continues, the more people walk away from the systems of power. And when these corporate interests feel threatened, they have the capacity to empower these proto-fascist organizations that celebrate the gun culture, that speak in the language of violence, and that do what all fascist movements do, which is to demonize the vulnerable. Muslims, undocumented workers, homosexuals, intellectuals, liberals, feminists, they have a very long list of people they hate. And fascism and violence run like a very dark, we are a very, very violent society. And I think that in times of instability, we cannot rule out that this